A German officer positioned himself near a Belgian farming area in mid-December 1944, observing the movement of Allied forces heading toward a strategic location. For nearly 60 minutes, he documented the passing convoy, transport trucks, armored carriers, tanks, and an overwhelming number of small utility vehicles. His previous combat experience on the Eastern Front had shown him Soviet supply columns, with perhaps a few dozen trucks at most. During his time in North Africa, British motorized units had been formidable yet manageable in size. However, what he witnessed now was entirely different in scale. Every several seconds, another small vehicle passed by. Some transported personnel, others towed trailers filled with munitions, some were equipped with mounted weapons, and others had been adapted for medical purposes. The variety was striking, but the total quantity was what truly unsettled him. His intelligence assessment would document roughly 200 Allied vehicles observed within a single hour on what was merely a secondary route. More than half were these small utility vehicles. His battalion leadership would review this assessment, acknowledge its significance with concern, and add it to numerous similar reports coming from throughout the Western Front. German intelligence personnel, trained in meticulous enemy capability analysis, were arriving at findings that contradicted everything their high command had been told regarding American manufacturing capacity. The Americans possessed more of these small vehicles than the Germans had trucks of any variety. This compact, practical, box-shaped vehicle that American forces called the Jeep had become omnipresent across every battlefield where German units encountered them. Following the Normandy landings in June, captured German intelligence documents showed assessments attempting to calculate American motor transport capability based on observed vehicle concentrations. The figures appeared impossible. Surely the assessments were inflated. Surely frontline personnel were observing the same vehicles repeatedly and miscounting. Yet the reports continued arriving from Italy, from France, from the Low Countries, wherever American forces deployed. These jeeps materialized in numbers that seemed to defy basic industrial reasoning. German soldiers began circulating speculation that every American service member received their own personal vehicle. This was an absurd overstatement, naturally, but it reflected a deeper psychological reality. The Germans could not comprehend the magnitude of what they were observing. This development wasn't anticipated. German pre-war intelligence had evaluated American manufacturing capability as considerable, but concentrated on mass production of consumer products rather than military hardware. The United States was wealthy, certainly, but perceived as comfortable and inefficient rather than possessing the disciplined sacrifice needed for total war. When Germany began rearmament during the 1930s, military strategists had incorporated American potential into their calculations. However, they assumed years would be necessary for the Americans to convert civilian manufacturing to military output. Years the Reich would utilize to secure continental Europe and position itself beyond reach. The Jeep represented something German strategic planning hadn't fully anticipated. It wasn't a miracle weapon. It mounted no powerful armament. It possessed no armor plating. It wasn't particularly fast or sophisticated. What made it significant was its existence in numbers, so vast they fundamentally altered the nature of warfare. An army with tens of thousands of these vehicles could move more rapidly, communicate more effectively, supply itself more efficiently, and respond to battlefield developments more quickly than any force in history. And the Americans hadn't just produced tens of thousands. They had manufactured more than 640,000 by war's end. The German officer in Belgium didn't know these production statistics. He only knew what he could observe, the endless stream of vehicles passing through farmland in the Ardennes, and he knew that his own unit's motor pool, carefully maintained and preserved, contained fewer vehicles than he had counted in a single hour on a single road, watching a single American division move to combat. To comprehend how Germany so thoroughly miscalculated American production capability. It's necessary to examine what German military strategists believed about motorization and modern warfare during the 1930s. The Wehrmacht prided itself on being a modern mechanized force. German propaganda showed columns of tanks and trucks moving rapidly across Poland and France, creating the impression of an entirely motorized army, overwhelming outdated adversaries. The reality was substantially different. The German army utilized approximately 2.7 million horses during the Second World War. Only armored divisions were fully motorized. The vast majority of German infantry marched on foot, and most artillery was horse-drawn until late in the conflict. This dependence on horses wasn't a choice rooted in romantic attachments to cavalry traditions. It was a necessity imposed by industrial capability. Germany simply couldn't manufacture enough trucks to motorize its entire army. The reasons were multiple and interconnected. Germany's automotive sector during the 1930s was substantial, manufacturing approximately 300,000 civilian vehicles annually by 1938, making it the third largest automobile producer globally behind the United States and Britain. However, this production was distributed among numerous manufacturers, each producing different models with non-standardized components. When war arrived, the Wehrmacht attempted to standardize its truck fleet around a few approved models. The program achieved limited success. Manufacturers continued producing variations based on pre-war designs. The result was a logistics nightmare. German motor pools contained dozens of different truck types, each requiring specific spare components. A battalion might possess Opel, Mercedes, and bussing trucks, plus captured French, Polish, and Soviet vehicles pressed into service out of desperate necessity. Maintaining this mixed collection required enormous effort. The German equivalent to the American Jeep was the Volkswagen Kübelwagen, a lightweight rear-wheel drive vehicle designed by Ferdinand Porsche. It was ingeniously simple, weighing 725 kilograms empty, which meant a crew could manhandle it out of difficult terrain. It was economical, using a small air-cooled engine, and it proved reliable under most conditions. German soldiers who used it praised its utility. However, it was not a Jeep. The Kübelwagen lacked four-wheel drive, limiting its cross-country capability. Its two-wheel drive configuration meant it struggled in mud, snow, and sand where Jeeps excelled. And critically, Germany produced only 50,435 Kübelwagens during the entire war, 50,000 vehicles against American Jeep production of 647,925. The ratio was nearly 13 to 1. This disparity didn't result from German engineering inferiority. The Kübelwagen was a competent design. The disparity emerged from fundamentally different industrial systems. German production operated under constraints that American industry didn't face. Raw materials were limited, particularly after Allied bombing disrupted supply lines and submarine warfare cut off overseas resources. Manufacturing capacity was distributed among many small and medium-sized firms, rather than concentrated in massive purpose-built facilities. Most critically, Germany was fighting a multi-front war from 1941 onward, forcing difficult allocation decisions between competing needs. Every truck produced for the Wehrmacht meant resources unavailable for tank production. Every Kübelwagen meant steel and rubber unavailable for aircraft. German planners constantly juggled competing demands, trying to maximize effectiveness across all domains while operating under severe resource constraints. Under these conditions, producing vehicles in six-figure quantities was simply impossible. American industry faced no such constraints. The United States had virtually unlimited raw materials from domestic sources and secure overseas supply lines. American factories were protected by two oceans from enemy attack. Most importantly, the American automotive industry had spent decades perfecting mass production techniques that could be directly applied to military vehicles. When the United States entered the war, It possessed the industrial infrastructure to produce military equipment in quantities that seemed fantastical to European observers. The Jeep would become the most visible symbol of that capacity, rolling off assembly lines at rates German planners had never imagined possible. The Jeep's origins lay in a request issued by the United States Army on July 11, 1940. The specifications were precise and demanding. The Army wanted a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle weighing no more than 590 kilograms, capable of carrying a crew of 3, equipped with four-wheel drive, and able to traverse terrain where conventional vehicles could not operate. It needed to be simple enough for rapid field maintenance and robust enough to survive the abuse of military service. 135 American automotive manufacturers received the request. Most ignored it. The specifications seemed impossible to meet, and the Army's budget for development was minimal. Only two companies submitted proposals initially: American Bantam Car Company, a struggling firm in Butler, Pennsylvania, and Willys Overland Motors of Toledo, Ohio. Ford Motor Company joined later. American Bantam, desperate for contracts to avoid bankruptcy, assigned engineer Carl Probst to the project. Probst had 5 days to create a complete design. He worked essentially without sleep, producing drawings and specifications for a vehicle that incorporated a Bantam chassis, a Willys engine, and various features. The result, called the Blitz buggy, weighed 690 kilograms, exceeding the Army's weight limit, but meeting all other requirements. The Army tested it at Camp Holabird, Maryland on September 23, 1940. It performed beyond expectations, climbing steep grades, traversing obstacles, and demonstrating remarkable durability. However, Bantam lacked the industrial capacity to produce vehicles in the quantities the Army would need. Willys Overland and Ford were brought into the program. What emerged from this competitive development was a vehicle that combined the best features from all three manufacturers. The Willys MB and Ford GPW, as they were designated, weighed approximately 1,400 kilograms empty, roughly double the original specification, but still remarkably light. They measured 3.36 meters long and 1.57 meters wide. A person of average height could easily see over the hood. The engine was Willys' Go Devil 4-cylinder, producing 60 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute. This gave the Jeep adequate power, while remaining mechanically simple and fuel efficient. The four-wheel drive system used Spicer differentials and transfer case, proven components from commercial trucks. The body was Ford's stamped steel design, which simplified production and reduced costs compared to original welded designs. Every aspect of the Jeep reflected American manufacturing philosophy. Standardization was absolute. Parts were interchangeable between Willys and Ford production. A wheel from a Willys MB would fit a Ford GPW. A transmission from one could be swapped into another. This interchangeability was revolutionary for military vehicles and essential for maintaining thousands of Jeeps. Across global supply lines, the production process demonstrated American industrial capability at its peak. To main manufacturers, Willys Overland in Toledo and Ford at multiple facilities, produced Jeeps using assembly line techniques perfected in automobile manufacturing. Workers who had built civilian cars now built military vehicles using the same methods, the same tools, the same organizational efficiency. At peak production, Jeeps rolled off assembly lines at a rate of 1 every 90 seconds. Not 1 per hour, not 1 per day, but 1 every 90 seconds, sustained across multiple shifts, 7 days per week, 4 years. The Toledo plant operated 24 hours daily. Ford's plants in River Rouge, Michigan, Louisville, Kentucky, and Dallas, Texas did the same. The production numbers were staggering. In 1941, approximately 8,500 Jeeps were built. In 1942, production reached 59,000. By 1943, annual production exceeded 150,000 units. Production continued through 1945, reaching a total of 647,925 vehicles. Each Jeep cost the United States government approximately $749 to produce, approximately $11,000 in modern currency. For this price, the Army received a vehicle that could function as a reconnaissance car, a weapons platform, an ambulance, a cargo carrier, a communications vehicle, or a command car. The versatility was unprecedented, and the quantity ensured that American forces would never lack transportation. No matter how demanding the operational environment, the reality of American Jeep production revealed itself gradually to German forces through countless small observations that accumulated into an unavoidable conclusion. In North Africa, when the Afrika Korps surrendered at Tunisia in May 1943, German prisoners walked past American motor parks and counted vehicles. One captured officer interrogated at a holding facility near Algiers told his American questioner that he had personally observed more Jeeps in a single Allied division's motor pool than his entire Panzer Army possessed in trucks of all types. The interrogator noted this comment in his report, filed it, and continued processing prisoners. Similar observations appeared in dozens of interrogation reports throughout the war. In Italy, German reconnaissance units reported American supply convoys moving through mountain roads with what seemed impossible frequency. A German intelligence summary from October 1943, captured after the war, noted American motor transport appeared unlimited. The summary's author calculated that based on observed vehicle density, the Americans must have deployed at least 10,000 Jeeps to the Italian theater. The actual number was higher. The Jeep's versatility complicated German tactical planning in unexpected ways. American units used Jeeps for roles that German doctrine assigned to multiple specialized vehicles. A single Jeep could function as a reconnaissance vehicle in the morning, an ambulance in the afternoon, and a weapons platform mounting a heavy machine gun in the evening. German forces trained to identify enemy capabilities based on vehicle types found American formations nearly impossible to categorize using conventional methods. In Normandy, after the June 6, 1944 landings, German forces attempting to counterattack discovered that American forward units possessed mobility that exceeded German expectations. American infantry companies, equipped with Jeeps for command and reconnaissance, could relocate faster than German units could respond. What German commanders assumed would be a static defensive position would be empty by the time assault forces arrived. The Americans had simply driven away, relocated, and established new positions miles distant. The Jeep's mechanical reliability presented another problem. German motor transport required constant maintenance. Vehicles broke down regularly. Supply lines delivering spare parts were essential to keeping units mobile. American Jeeps, by contrast, seemed nearly indestructible. They operated in conditions that would disable German vehicles. They required minimal maintenance, and when they did break down, American mechanics had them operational again within hours because parts were standardized and abundant. German mechanic captured in France in August 1944 told his interrogators about examining a captured Jeep. He expected to find complex, sophisticated engineering. What he found instead was elegant simplicity. The engine was basic but robust. The transmission was straightforward. The suspension was crude but effective. Everything was designed for ease of maintenance and repair. The Jeep was not technically superior to German vehicles. It was operationally superior because it kept working. The psychological impact of Jeep ubiquity extended beyond tactical considerations. German soldiers taught that Germany possessed Europe's most advanced industrial economy struggled to reconcile what they had been told with what they observed. If the Americans could produce vehicles in such quantities that every squad seemed to have its own transportation, what did that imply about comparative industrial capacity? German intelligence officers attempted to calculate American Jeep production based on observed deployment numbers. Their estimates varied wildly because the scale seemed impossible. Some analysts concluded that American forces must be concentrating all available vehicles in specific sectors to create an illusion of abundance. Others suggested that the vehicles being observed were the same ones being moved repeatedly to deceive reconnaissance. These explanations were comforting but wrong. The actual production figures, had German intelligence possessed them, would have been almost incomprehensible. By mid-1944, American factories were producing more than 15,000 Jeeps per month. That was more vehicles in a single month than Germany produced in an entire year across all light vehicle categories, and Jeep production was only a small fraction of American motor vehicle output. Trucks, half-tracks, and other vehicles rolled off American assembly lines in similarly impossible quantities. The industrial disparity was not marginal. It was absolute. The moment of full realization came not in a single dramatic revelation, but in accumulated exposure to American logistical capability across multiple fronts. For individual German soldiers, the turning point often occurred when they entered American custody and saw firsthand what industrial warfare at scale actually looked like. A prisoner of war processing centers in France and Belgium during late 1944. Captured German soldiers walked through American logistics bases that occupied entire towns. They saw motor parks containing hundreds of Jeeps arranged in neat rows. They saw supply depots with stacks of spare parts organized by type. They saw maintenance facilities where damaged vehicles were repaired and returned to service within days. The scale and organization were unlike anything in German military experience. One captured German non-commissioned officer, interviewed at a processing center in Belgium in December 1944, described his reaction to seeing American supply operations. He had commanded a motorized infantry platoon on the Eastern Front. His unit owned 3 trucks, 2 of which were captured Soviet vehicles. Keeping those 3 trucks operational consumed enormous effort. Parts were scarce. Mechanics improvised repairs using whatever materials they could find. When a truck broke down irreparably, it was cannibalized to keep the others running. The American motor park he observed contained more vehicles than his entire regiment had possessed, and these were not carefully guarded, precious assets. They were routine equipment, casually maintained, readily replaced if damaged beyond repair. The abundance seemed wasteful to German eyes accustomed to scarcity, but the waste itself demonstrated capacity. An army that could afford to be wasteful with equipment possessed resources beyond German comprehension. German prisoners transported to camps in the United States experienced even more profound disorientation. They traveled through American industrial cities and saw factories operating at full capacity. They saw civilian automobiles on roads in quantities that exceeded German military vehicle totals. They worked on American farms and received rations better than what German frontline troops were receiving in Europe. The cognitive dissonance was severe. A German officer held at a camp in Texas wrote in a letter, later intercepted by camp censors, that he had been taught America was a decadent nation weakened by luxury and individualism. After 6 months in captivity, working on farms and seeing American society function under wartime conditions, he no longer believed what he had been taught. The Americans were not weakened by prosperity, they were strengthened by it. Their industrial capacity was not theoretical. It was visible everywhere. The comparison between American and German Jeep production encapsulated the broader industrial disparity. Germany had produced approximately 50,000 Kubel wagons during the entire war. The United States had produced nearly 650,000 Jeeps. The ratio was 13-1, but even this understates the difference because German production had declined steadily after 1943 due to bombing, resource shortages, and the diversion of industrial capacity to other weapons systems. American production had increased steadily throughout the war, reaching peak efficiency in 1940-4. For German military leadership, the implications were clear by mid-1944. They could not win a war of attrition against an opponent with such overwhelming industrial superiority. Every German vehicle destroyed was difficult to replace. Every American vehicle destroyed was replaced within weeks. Every German casualty represented a gap in an increasingly thin defensive line. Every American casualty was replaced by fresh troops arriving from an apparently inexhaustible pool of manpower. The Jeep itself was not a war-winning weapon. It carried no powerful armament, it threatened no strategic target. But it represented something more significant than any individual weapon system. It represented an industrial capacity so vast that it could produce utility vehicles by the hundreds of thousands, while simultaneously producing tanks, aircraft, ships, and munitions in equally staggering quantities. That capacity, more than any tactical innovation or strategic brilliance, determined the war's outcome. The evidence of American industrial supremacy infested in specific documentable moments that German forces could not rationalize away. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, German forces achieved tactical surprise and initial success in the Ardennes offensive. Wehrmacht units advanced rapidly, capturing American supply dumps and equipment. German soldiers examining captured American positions found jeeps abandoned intact, sometimes with keys still in the ignition. The vehicles had been left behind not because they were disabled, but because retreating American units knew replacements would be available immediately. A German panzer commander, whose unit captured an American supply depot near Bastogne, reported finding 47 jeeps parked in organized rows. His entire division possessed fewer operational vehicles than what he found in a single American supply dump serving a single division. His forces took every jeep they could drive, using them to supplement their own depleted motor pool. Within days, many of these captured jeeps were destroyed or recaptured by American counterattacks. The Americans replaced them effortlessly. The German offensive ultimately failed, not because of tactical errors, but because of logistical reality. German spearheads ran out of fuel. American forces, supplied by an endless stream of trucks and jeeps moving supplies forward from secure rear areas, maintained their defensive positions and counterattacked. By January 1945, the Bulge was eliminated and German forces were retreating back to their start lines, having lost men and equipment they could not replace. German intelligence documents captured after the war revealed that Wehrmacht analysts had attempted to calculate American vehicle production in multiple methodologies. One approach examined observed vehicle density in combat zones and extrapolated backward to estimate total production. Another analyzed captured vehicle serial numbers to estimate manufacturing dates and production rates. A third method attempted to calculate industrial capacity based upon known American factory capabilities. All three methods produced results that German intelligence officers initially rejected as impossible. The numbers were too large. No nation could produce vehicles in such quantities while simultaneously producing everything else required for global warfare. The analysts rechecked their calculations, revised their assumptions, and reached similar conclusions. The numbers were not errors. They were accurate assessments of American industrial capacity. By early 1945, German prisoners arriving at interrogation centers no longer expressed surprise at American equipment abundance. They had been conditioned by months of battlefield experience to expect Americans to have unlimited supplies. Some expressed anger that their own leadership had committed Germany to war against an opponent with such overwhelming material superiority. Others expressed resignation that defeat had been inevitable once American industry fully mobilized. The Jeep served as a visible constant reminder of the disparity. Every German soldier who encountered American forces saw Jeeps. They were omnipresent. They appeared in reconnaissance photos. They were visible in captured positions. They transported wounded, whole supplies, mounted weapons, and carried officers. Their ubiquity was so complete that General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, would later identify the Jeep as one of 3 tools that won the war, alongside the C-47 Dakota transport aircraft and landing craft. Eisenhower's assessment was not hyperbolic. The Jeep did not win battles through firepower. It won them through logistics. An army with tens of thousands of Jeeps could move faster, communicate better, and respond to changing battlefield conditions more effectively than any force in history. That mobility and flexibility, multiplied across divisions and armies, created operational advantages that tactical skill alone could not overcome. For German forces in the war's final months, fighting became an exercise in postponing the inevitable. They faced opponents who possessed not only numerical superiority, but also material abundance beyond anything German industry could produce. The Jeep rolling through liberated French towns and German villages in spring 1945 symbolized that abundance. It represented an industrial system that had answered the question of modern warfare's most fundamental requirement: not superior technology, not innovative tactics, but the capacity to produce everything needed for war in quantities that exceeded any opponent's ability to destroy them. The Jeep's role in Allied victory extended far beyond the European theatre's conclusion. In May 1945, when Germany surrendered, American forces occupied a shattered nation whose infrastructure had been systematically destroyed by years of strategic bombing and ground combat. The Jeep became the primary vehicle of occupation forces, navigating rubble-filled streets and connecting isolated communities across a divided Germany. In the immediate post-war period, the contrast between American mobility and German immobility became even more pronounced. German cities lacked functioning motor transport. Civilians walked or used bicycles. The few remaining German military vehicles had been confiscated or destroyed. American occupation forces, by contrast, possessed thousands of Jeeps that facilitated everything from mail delivery to military police patrols to the transportation of displaced persons. German civilians encountered Jeeps as symbols of both defeat and reconstruction. American soldiers drove Jeeps through towns where no motor vehicles had operated in months. Children learned to recognize the distinctive engine sound and the boxy silhouette. For many Germans, particularly in rural areas, the Jeep was their first sustained contact with American power. It wasn't threatening like a tank or intimidating like a bomber. It was simply present everywhere, constantly, a rolling reminder of American industrial capacity. The psychological impact on German military personnel who had survived the war was profound and lasting. Former Wehrmacht officers interviewed years later by historians consistently mentioned American equipment abundance as the factor that made German defeat inevitable. They did not speak primarily of tactical defeats or strategic errors. They spoke of facing an opponent who replaced losses faster than German forces could inflict them. One former German tank commander interviewed in the 1970s described his experience in Normandy during summer 1944. His unit destroyed several American Jeeps during a successful ambush. He felt satisfaction at the small victory. 2 days later, he observed the same American unit operating with what appeared to be the same number of Jeeps. The vehicles his forces had destroyed had been replaced immediately. His own unit, meanwhile, was still waiting for spare parts for a disabled tank. That moment, he said, was when he understood Germany would lose the war. The Jeep's ubiquity in post-war Europe created a lasting impression on multiple generations. Children who grew up in occupied Germany during the late 1940s associated Jeeps with American soldiers distributing food, providing medical care, and enforcing orders. The vehicle became so familiar that it transcended its military origins and entered popular culture. European automobile manufacturers studied the Jeep's design and created their own versions. The Land Rover, introduced in Britain in 1948, was directly inspired by Jeeps that British forces had used during the war. The Toyota Land Cruiser, introduced in Japan in 1951, showed clear influence from American Jeep design philosophy. for American forces. The Jeep remained in service long after the Second World War ended. The same basic design, with modifications, served in Korea, in early Vietnam operations, and in countless peacetime deployments. The Willys MB and Ford GPW gave way to updated models, but the fundamental concept remained unchanged. A lightweight four-wheel drive go-anywhere utility vehicle had proven its value in the Second World War and continued proving it for decades. Afterward, the production infrastructure that had built 647,000 Jeeps during the war demonstrated capabilities that extended beyond military applications. Willys Overland transitioned to civilian Jeep production in 1945, creating a new market for recreational and agricultural four-wheel drive vehicles. The lessons learned in wartime mass production informed American manufacturing for generations. Assembly line techniques perfected for Jeep production influenced post-war automobile manufacturing, contributing to American industrial dominance in the 1950s and 60s. The Jeep had entered the war as an experimental vehicle meeting urgent military requirements. It emerged as an icon of American industrial power and remained a symbol of that power. For the rest of the 20th century, the story of American Jeep production versus German Kübelwagen production encapsulated a fundamental truth about the Second World War that extends far beyond any single weapon system or battle. Modern industrial warfare was decided not primarily by tactical brilliance or individual courage, but by industrial capacity and logistical sustainability. Germany entered the Second World War with a military that appeared modern and mechanized. Propaganda images showed columns of tanks and motorized infantry advancing rapidly across Poland and France. The reality, visible only to those involved in actual operations, was far different. The Wehrmacht relied heavily on horses, required constant improvisation to maintain equipment, and struggled with chronic shortages of everything from fuel to spare parts. The United States entered the Second World War with an economy that had spent the 1930s perfecting mass production techniques. American industry had developed assembly lines that could produce automobiles in unprecedented quantities. When war came, those same techniques were applied to military production. Factories that had built civilian cars now built Jeeps, trucks, and tanks using identical organizational methods. The result was production at scales that exceeded anything Germany could achieve. The Jeep to Kübelwagen ratio of 13:1 was not an isolated statistic. Similar ratios appeared across nearly every category of military equipment. American factories produced approximately 88,000 tanks during the Second World War compared to Germany's approximately 49,000. American shipyards launched nearly 6,000 major naval vessels compared to Germany's few hundred. American aircraft production exceeded 300,000 aircraft compared to Germany's approximately 119,000. These numbers represented more than quantitative superiority. They represented fundamentally different approaches to industrial warfare. Germany's economy, even under Albert Speer's rationalization efforts from 1940 to onward, never fully mobilized for total war. Civilian production continued. Consumer goods remained available. Industrial resources were divided among competing priorities. The result was chronic shortage across all military categories. The United States, protected by geography from direct attack on its industrial base, could fully commit to war production without fear of disruption. American civilians experienced rationing and shortages certainly, but American factories operated at maximum capacity 24 hours daily, producing war materials in quantities that seemed impossible to Axis observers. The American industrial system was not inherently superior to Germany's in terms of technology or engineering capability. It was superior in scale, organization, and freedom from interference. The Jeep story also revealed the importance of design philosophy in military equipment. German military vehicles tended towards specialization. Different vehicles were designed for different purposes, each optimized for specific roles. This created logistical complexity. Supply systems needed to stock parts for dozens of different vehicle types. Maintenance crews needed specialized training for each model. Tactical flexibility suffered because units depended on having the right vehicle type available for specific tasks. American design philosophy, exemplified by the Jeep, emphasized versatility and standardization. A single vehicle type could perform multiple roles through field modifications and improvisation. Standardized parts meant simplified logistics. Simplified logistics meant faster repairs and higher operational readiness. The Jeep was not the best vehicle for any specific task, but it was good enough for most tasks, and it was available in quantities that made its versatility operationally decisive. The broader lesson extends beyond the Second World War. The conflicts that followed, from Korea to Vietnam to Cold War competitions, repeatedly demonstrated that industrial capacity and logistical sustainability determined outcomes as much as tactical proficiency or technological sophistication. Nations with the ability to produce and maintain military equipment in large quantities possessed decisive advantages over opponents who could not match that capacity. The Jeep became the symbol of this lesson because it was visible, ubiquitous, and comprehensible. Anyone could understand what it meant when one side had 650,000 Jeeps and the other had 50,000 Kubel wagons. The mathematics were simple. The implications were profound. Industrial warfare rewarded those who could produce more, faster, and keep it working longer than their opponents. The German officer who stood in that Belgian field in December 1944 counting American vehicles moving toward Bastogne witnessed a truth that German strategic planning had failed to adequately consider. The United States possessed an industrial capacity so vast that it could wage global war on multiple fronts simultaneously while maintaining production levels that exceeded anything Germany could achieve even when focused solely on European operations. His reconnaissance report, filed and eventually captured by advancing American forces, became one of thousands of similar documents that revealed German awareness of the disparity. But awareness came too late. By the time German military personnel fully understood the scale of American industrial mobilization, the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. The only question remaining was how long Germany would continue fighting against an opponent whose material superiority grew more overwhelming with each passing month. The Jeep's significance extended beyond its tactical utility, its impressive production numbers. It represented a fundamental shift in how wars would be fought in the industrial age. Victory would not necessarily belong to the side with the best soldiers or the most innovative tactics, but to the side that could sustain operations through superior logistics and industrial output. Germany had challenged that economy to war. The 647,000 Jeeps rolling through Europe in 1945 represented part of the answer to that challenge.